wholeheartedly welcome Dr. Sujit Sarkhel sir for being here for this presentation. I welcome all the Tamil Nadu IPS RCBC members, the faculties, the consultants from Tamil Nadu who were joined, and other states also who were joined here. I wholeheartedly welcome our students who have joined here, and I also welcome the presenter, Dr. Jeyanthy Pryadarshni S. Now, the time is over to Dr. Anbazhagan sir for introduction of the speaker. Anbazhagan sir.
Thank you, Shivaraman sir.
Yes.
Good afternoon, one and all. I have immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Sujit Sarkhel, MD DPM, who is a guest speaker today. And to say about Dr. Sujit Sarkhel, he's graduated from Central Institute of Psychiatry, Ranchi, and he's currently working as professor, Institute of Psychiatry, Kolkatta. He's an honorary editor, Indian Journal of Psychiatry, and also assistant editor, Indian Journal of Private Psychiatry. He was a past editor of Bengal Journal of Psychiatry and the Eastern Journal of Psychiatry. He's also editorial board member, Indian Journal of Psychological Medicine. He's a co-editor of IPS textbooks. Particularly, he authored the chapter of Indian perspectives of suicide and recent advances in psychiatry. And he had published more than 70 publications in national as well as international peer-reviewed journals. And his areas of interest were on suicide, research methodology, obsessive compulsive disorder, child and adolescent psychiatry, and genetics. He has overall 15 years of research experience, and he is a member of Indian Psychiatric Society, Indian Association of Private Psychiatry, and the Indian Association of Geriatric Mental Health. He's now here, and he would be addressing on a topic on translation and validation of rating skills after the article presentation by the presenter, Dr. Jeyanthy Pryadarshni. Now it's time to introduce the speaker, the presenter of this article. Today, the article for discussion taken up is in the title of Information Overload Regarding COVID-19, Adaptation and Validation of the Cancer Information Overload Scale. This will be presented by Dr. Jeyanthy Pryadarshni S, who is currently doing MD Psychiatry in Karpaga Vinayaga Institute of Medical Sciences and Research Center, Chengalpat. Thank you very much, and now it's time to Dr. Pryadarshni to continue. Dr. Pryadarshni, please take over.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I am excited to discuss a noteworthy study authored by Dr. Sujit Sarkhel, Dr. Ajay Kumar Bakla, Dr. Samir Kumar Prakaraj, and Dr. Malay Kumar Ghoshal, published in the Indian Journal of Psychiatry on October 10, 2020. The article is titled Information Overload Regarding COVID-19, Adaptation and Validation of the Cancer Information Overload Scale. Introduction. COVID-19 originated in Wuhan, China in December 2019 and quickly spread globally. By March 2020, the WHO declared it a pandemic. As the virus spread, fear and panic became widespread. With the rise of social media and smartphones, the flood of information about COVID-19 contributed to increasing anxiety and confusion. At the start of the lockdowns, when everyone was suddenly homebound, people turned to every available source for information about the pandemic, from websites, social media, to newspapers, TV channels, and even through word of mouth. There was a relentless flow of information. However, with this came a new issue, a flood of sometimes conflicting information. This created confusion and concern for many in India, mirroring the experiences of people globally. Information overload describes a situation in which the amount of information provided within a specific time frame exceeds an individual's capacity to process it. When overwhelmed, people may misinterpret facts, make mistakes, or avoid the information altogether. Research on cancer information overload has demonstrated that it can lead to negative outcomes such as avoiding screening measures and failing to adhere to appropriate preventive actions. It is essential to investigate information overload concerning COVID-19 related information because, like cancer information overload, it may result in adverse effects, including avoidance of help-seeking behavior, which can hinder the timely detection of illnesses at the community level. Information overload has been previously assessed using the Cancer Information Overload Scale (CIOS) in cancer patients. Since this is the only scale available for examining information overload in health conditions, they chose to adapt it for studying information overload related to COVID-19 pandemic. This study aimed to adapt and validate the 8-item CIOS for studying information overload in relation to COVID-19 among Indian citizens who could read and write in English. Methodology. An online survey was conducted from May 26, 2020 to June 6, 2020 using Google Forms. Sampling technique used was non-probability sampling. The selected contacts aimed to provide proportional representation regarding various professions, age groups, and genders. Each investigator shared the survey link via text messages or WhatsApp with 75 of their contacts. In total, the link was distributed to 300 respondents. To validate the scale, the minimum required sample size is typically considered to be 10 times the number of items in the scale. Therefore, for the 8-item cancer information overload scale, a minimum sample size of 80 participants was necessary for validation. Tools. The questionnaire was developed as a Google form and included a series of questions about socioeconomic and clinical variables such as age, sex, education, occupation, religion, and the sources from which the participants regularly obtained information about COVID-19 and their screen time. Following the socio-demographic section, participants were required to complete the 8-item Corona Information Overload Scale. This scale was adapted from the previously validated Cancer Information Overload Scale, which is an 8-item Likert type scale designed to assess information overload in cancer patients. The item in the scale that contained the term cancer were modified to use COVID-19 instead. Statistical analysis. Sample characteristics were described using percentages, means, and standard deviations. For the modified 8-item Corona Information Overload Scale, they calculated univariate summary statistics, Pearson item total correlation, the scale mean if item deleted, and Cronbach's alpha coefficient. The Kaiser-Meyer-Olkin test was conducted to assess the sample adequacy for factor analysis, while Bartlett's test of sphericity was performed to evaluate the factorability of the correlation matrix. Principal component analysis was executed to uncover the factor structure of the modified 8-item Corona Information Overload Scale. The number of factors to retain was determined using Kaiser's criterion of eigenvalues greater than 1, inspection of Cattell's Scree plot, and Horn's parallel analysis via Keeling's regression equation. Both orthogonal and oblique rotations were performed with Kaiser's normalization to identify the optimal solution. A factor loading cutoff of 0.4 was deemed significant following Stevens' recommendation. The item loadings obtained from the factor analysis were utilized to calculate the average variance extracted to evaluate the convergent validity. Results. Online response of a total of 183 participants were received and all were included in the study. Thus, the response rate was 61%, which may be considered as fair. The mean age of the sample was 36.2 years with standard deviation of 11.1. Nearly 58.5% of the sample was male with female 41%. and they have managed to achieve almost an equal gender distribution. Here, there was a greater representation of highly educated participants with 51% of postgraduates and 42% of graduates. The modified 8-item Corona Information Overload scale was used as a Likert scale with scoring 1 to 4 based on responses from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The most frequent choice was strongly agree with 47%, followed by disagree with 36.7%, and strongly disagree 8.4%, and strongly agree is 7.9%. Overall, 55% of responses were agreed or strongly agreed to information overload. The mean score and standard deviation of individual items were also tabulated, which ranged from 2.14 to 2.87. The mean total score of the scale was 20.35 with standard deviation 3.77, which is 63.5% of maximum possible score of 32. The Cronbach's alpha for full scale was 0.804 and scale mean if item deleted ranges from 17.48 to 18.21. Cronbach's alpha if item deleted ranged from 0.771 to 0.787. The Pearson item to total correlation were found to be significant, that is p-value less than 0.001. Principal component analysis, PCA showed two components with an initial eigenvalue of 3.38 and 1.09 with 42.3% and 13.6% of variance respectively, making a total of around more than 55% of variance. Scree plot showed point of inflection after two components. The first factor has rotated an eigenvalue of 2.31 and explained 28.9% of variance consisting of the first 5 items of the scale. The second item, there is not enough time to do all the things recommended to prevent COVID-19, has the highest loading with both rotations, 0.857 in Varimax and 0.944 in Oblimin. The fifth item has the lowest factor loading both with both rotations, 0.549 in Varimax and 0.538 in Oblimin. The first component with all these 5 items together may be named as excessiveness of information. The second factor has rotated eigenvalue of 2.16 and explained 27.1% of the variance. It consisted of the last 3 items of the scale with high loading. Varimax rotated solution has the highest loading, 0.778 for item number 6. I forgot most COVID-19 related information right after I hear it. The second component with these 3 items together may be named as rejection of information. Information overload refers to when a person feels confused and overwhelmed by an excess of information beyond their ability to process it. The Cancer Information Overload Scale is a well-validated tool widely used for assessing cancer-related information overload. The Cancer Information Overload Scale has also been adapted for conditions like atrial fibrillation, healthy diet information, and some safety behaviors. Information overload can significantly influence healthy behaviors during COVID-19. Therefore, this study aimed to assess the psychometric properties of the 8-item Corona Information Overload Scale with the objective of adapting and validating the scale for measuring information overload related to COVID-19 among Indian citizens. Internal consistency of Corona Information Overload Scale. In this study, they found a Cronbach's alpha of 0.8 for the full 8-item scale, indicating satisfactory internal consistency. This aligns with a similar Cronbach's alpha of 0.8 reported by Raymond and Ramirez. Another study by Obamero and Lee reported a high Cronbach's alpha of 0.86 with all items loading onto a single factor. A higher Cronbach's alpha reflects greater interrelatedness between items or a more homogeneous construct, suggesting unidimensionality. The Cronbach's alpha in this instrument indicates item interrelatedness, but it is not high enough to imply unidimensionality. Pearson's item total correlation in this study was significant, showing that all items in the corona information overload scale was correlated with each other, further supporting its reliability. Factor analysis. Principal component analysis, often preferred for data reduction techniques, provided a straightforward solution that was easier to interpret compared to other methods. PCA with Varimax rotation identified two factors with eigenvalue 2.31 and 2.16, explaining 28.9% and 27.07% of the variance respectively. They label these factors as excessiveness of information and rejection of information. However, parallel analysis indicated a single factor comprising 5 items, aligning with the findings of a previous study by Obamero and Lee. Accepting a single factor structure as supported by the parallel analysis, while rejecting the two-factor construct of corona information overload scale is not a straightforward decision. However, a closer examination of the second factor, rejection of information, reveals it is challenging to disregard. They observed a higher average variance extracted and a square root of average variance extracted for the second factor compared to the first factor. Notably, the second factor meets the conventional threshold for convergent validity of 0.5. Item number 8, I feel overloaded by the amount of COVID-19 information I am supposed to know, encapsulates the overall concepts of the information overload. It is even suggested as a standalone item for the information overload scale. In this study, this item had the second highest mean contribution to the total score and was associated with rejection of information. The contradictory factor structure may stem from the intensity of illness and information overload. Previous studies using the parent version of the cancer information overload scale predominantly focused on chronic non-communicable diseases such as cancer, nutritional issues, sun safety behaviors, or atrial fibrillation. These conditions do not compare to the sheer volume and intensity of information related to COVID-19 pandemic, which has likely reached the level of an infodemic. The amount of information available now far exceeds that of the previously studied conditions, both in volume and in the level of fear it generates. Furthermore, COVID-19 related information is often inconsistent, inconclusive, experimental, unscientific, confusing, and rapidly evolving, contributing to this infodemic phenomenon. The concept of excessiveness of information does not equate to the idea of information overload. Instead, rejection appears to be a core construct. This rejection may arise as a response to perceived excessiveness, futility, erroneous or fake information, or ambiguity aversion. The rejection of information is not solely a cognitive response, it is also behaviorally linked to reduced preventive health behaviors, as observed in reactions to cancer-related information. The development of cognitive fatigue and rejection may foster a sense of fatalism, characterized by beliefs in predestination, pessimism, and attributing one's health to luck. These points support the notion of moving away from a unitary construct and advocate for a multifactorial approach to the corona information overload scale within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has been suggested that the corona information overload scale could be adapted to identify situation characterized by an excess of available health information. The result can help refine this information, making it more accurate and customized for improved self-management. While the information overload scale was originally developed for various chronic non-communicable diseases, they have found the construct to be applicable to the preventive aspects of COVID-19. Understanding the information and its overload is critical for shaping health-related preventive behaviors. The Corona Information Overload Scale adapted for COVID-19 seems to be a valid and reliable scale for assessing health information overload. It consists of two components, excessiveness of information and rejection of information. Additionally, 55% of respondents indicated they experienced information overload. Further studies are needed to validate the scale in other populations to enhance its generalizability. Critical appraisal. The aim of the study was clear. The study design was appropriate for the stated aim. The sample size was also justified. The target population was not explicitly defined beyond being the known contacts of the investigators, with efforts made to represent various ages, professions, and genders. However, there was no specific mention of an overarching population or criteria such as a defined age range, geographic area, or other relevant characteristics beyond those reachable by the investigators. This could introduce potential sampling bias as the population is based on the convenience of the personal contacts rather than a randomly selected or more systematically chosen group. And no measures were mentioned to address or categorize non-responders in the study. The researchers did not indicate any follow-up with those who did not respond or any strategies to analyze the characteristics of the non-responders. The statistical methods were sufficiently described and the basic data was also adequately described. Yes, the response rate does raise concern about the non-response bias. Though the response rate is higher than the expected, without knowing the characteristics of non-responders, it is difficult to assess how representative the responses are. And the results were internally consistent, and the results represent for all the analysis were described in the methods. Authors' discussion and conclusions were also justified by the results. Limitations of the study were also discussed. While the study's contributions are clear, there are a few additional critical points I'd like to discuss. While the survey attempted to ensure representation across professions, the educational attainment of the participants was high, with over 90% holding graduate or postgraduate degrees. This might have skewed the results, as those with higher education may process information differently from the general public. The study relied on online surveys distributed via WhatsApps and text messages. As internet usage and familiarity with online tools tend to be higher among younger and more educated individuals, older adults or those with limited internet access were underrepresented. The findings of the study may not be generalizable beyond the specific demographic like urban, educated, or smartphone users due to the limited diversity of the sample. Future research should address these limitations to enhance validity and generalizability. Thank you very much. It's been a privilege to present today.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for that very clear and concise presentation.
Basically, the reason is, first of all, my thanks to the RCBC team entirely for this program, for having called me here, and Dr. S.Sivaraman and others. Thanks to Dr. Siva Ilango for having guided, and the PG participant also. See, basically, why I had chosen this study, there are two elements of it. One was it that during the presentation, probably adaptation and validation would be discussed. And we had not taken up translation, but these days we are getting a lot of queries, questions, and papers related to translation also. So I thought that in my presentation, I will briefly discuss translation and adaptation rather than validation. There are two reasons for that. Validation involves a lot of hardcore statistical measures, which would usually drag it a little longer and maybe a little more complicated also. Probably it's a whole one-day workshop kind of a thing. So, but I thought that translation and adaptation is something which we all all the PGs should know about. And the reason for that is two. First of all, one is there are areas where we can actually take up independent projects wherein we can translate an existing scale and adapt it to the particular Indian language or population. This is one. Secondly, many of the theses which ultimately get published or which are attempted for publication, these days I am seeing that papers coming out of it, they actually have self-report scales which are used in the local population, and there is no mention of translation. See, this is a major, and this is coming as a major criticism from reviewers. So for example, I undertake a study on and assess depression with the help of Bake Depression Inventory, which is a self-report scale, and I pass it on to the respondents, and the scale has not been translated into local language. And at the same time, in my inclusion criteria, I include Tamil speaking people, for example. So a person who is not proficient in English but would be extremely comfortable in Tamil, obviously he would not be giving a good response. He can at the most try to hide his actual response. So that way, the scale, if you are using a self-report scale in English to a person who is not very proficient in English, I think that is one of the major flaws. And in fact, if we look at the papers that are coming these days, most of it ignores this. So they are not primarily for translation and validation, but they have used a non-translated scale on a population which is not very good or proficient in English. So we should at least follow the basic outlines before we send these kinds of papers for publication in any journal. So if I have used it on if my student has used it, then at the time of administering the scale, there should be an attempt at a minimum level of translation and validation. It may not be completely as big as a validation for a paper, but at least the basic steps of translation should be followed and mentioned in the paper in order to make it methodologically sound. I think that is one of the main reasons why I took it up. So coming briefly to how to go for translation followed by adaptation. So basically there are different steps: forward translation, then you have synthesis, then you have backward translation, then you have an expert committee review, then pre-testing, cognitive interviewing, final version, and documentation. So these are grossly these steps. So can I have the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Yes. So a forward translation, in forward translation, this is the first step. So for example, I am converting, for example, Big Depression Inventory. I am trying to translate it into Tamil. So what is the basic requirement? First, I will need to forward translate. Forward translate means from English to Tamil. How many translators you need, or how many people should be on the job? First of all, whichever person is the principal investigator or the main researcher or a group of researchers, ideally he or she should not be in the translation job. This is the usual requirement of most of the protocols. So ideally, some mention one and some mention two. If you look at the standardized WHO guidelines, they say that one translator whose mother tongue is the native language, I mean Tamil in this case, but who is equally proficient in English, so is a bilingual translator, and preferably a person who is aware of the health related concepts. So here, in case of BDI, a mental health professional whose mother tongue is Tamil and who is equally or quite proficient in English to understand the terms and translate them should be one choice. So a mental health professional, because one who is familiar with the concepts used in the instrument, concepts of depression, somatic phenomena, and all that. So this is one requirement. Some authorities require another neutral translator who is more of a linguistic expert, not a mental health professional or not a professional who will be aware of the concepts of depression, mental health, and all that. For example, someone who is just a teacher, maybe a librarian, somebody who is not directly involved with the concept. So those authorities say that one professional aware with the concept, another translator who is a purely layman. So these two people will make a forward translation, and there will be a meeting wherein the translated versions, the two translated versions, will be matched with each other, and the discrepancies will be addressed, preferably by a committee, so that a final consensus could be reached. So as I've said, that if two versions emerge, the synthesis of the two needs to be done by the expert committee. At the same time, even if there is only one translator, there can be certain issues that can come up during translation. So anyway, a synthesis has to be done and resolution has to be done by the expert committee. So who are the members of the expert committee? Can we have the next slide? So usually expert panel consists of bilingual experts as expected, knowing both the languages. Members should consist of translators as well as experts in the field, in this case mental health professionals. Some recommend language experts should also be a part of the expert panel because there are certain issues with semantics, the usage of language, which may not always be easily solvable by mental health professionals or doctors or psychiatrists. Those issues may actually require code linguistic competence. So the main job of this panel is to figure out and resolve the discrepancies at each stage of the translation and adaptation process. And the WHO very clearly says that you should look for cultural equivalence. So if somebody is saying winds in the stomach, maybe if you are using gas in the local language, it is still okay. There should be some kind of a cultural equivalence wherein people understand the difference between the two, and always you should not try to match them literally. Literal meaning is less important and cultural meaning is more important. Next slide. Now, once you are done and once the committee has synthesized the final forward translated version, Tamil translation in this case, then one actually goes for a backward translation. So here is one person. This is interesting, which many people actually do not follow. You will actually have to look for a person whose mother tongue is English, but who is equally expert in Tamil and English. So usually that is the ideal requirement of a backward translator. And the backward translator need not be a person who is an expert. Rather, it is ideally or preferred that a person is a lay person who will completely back translate the version back into English. Now, once you back translate, you will have to sit and look for the discrepancies that have arisen between the original English version and the back translated English version. Can I have the next slide? So all this discrepancies, everything included, the expert committee finally sits. So this is the fifth step. The expert committee reviews all versions and synthesizes the pre-final version for field testing. So what are the things that they look for from the original scale to the translated scale? Semantic equivalence means the language, the meaning conveyed in English should be similarly conveyed in Tamil also. Those words, semantic equivalence. Conceptual equivalence. So if I am giving the concept of distress, emotional distress, whether it is in English or in Tamil or in Hindi, the distress should be equivalently expressed in this translated version also. cultural equivalence, gas, wind, some kinds of weakness. So there are many cultural idioms of distress which may have a little different expression in different cultures. So that equivalence should also be thought. And also idiomatic equivalence, which means certain common phrase verbs or group of verbs which are used in different cultures. So exact meaning of those idioms may not be available in a local language. So one should try to look for something which is as close as possible to that one. So that is why we need bilingual experts. So semantic equivalence, most important, conceptual equivalence and cultural equivalence, very, very important. But you should also think about idiomatic equivalence in certain cases. So after considering all this, they go for a pre-final version. Pre-final version means the version which will be sent for field testing. I mean, you will actually have to test the instrument now on the people who are likely to be the subjects of the final scale. So next. So this is the final, this is the pre-final step, rather, pre-testing and cognitive interviewing. Pre-testing should be done on, it depends. WHO talks about 10 subjects, other authorities talk about minimum 30 subjects. We usually, I would say that 30 subjects should be the minimum on whom the scale should be applied for pre-testing. Basic idea of pre-testing is you are applying it on the subjects. For example, if you have translated BDI, you are expecting to apply it on patients having depression. So on 30 patients of depression, you are applying this scale and you are trying to find out whether the respondents have any difficulty in understanding the expression, whether they have any difficulty in generating the response, and whether they are comfortable with the terms used and the meanings conveyed to them. So this is something which you have to take a feedback from them during those 30 interviews, I mean, or rather those 30 cases. This is basically called as debriefing, wherein you will have to discuss what are the difficulties faced, what was the good part, what was the bad part of the scale, what was the area that they could not understand. And based on this feedback, the committee sits again and prepares the final version. Once the final version is prepared, all these steps have to be very clearly documented. And this is the final version, which is now ready for validation on a much larger group of people. And this is when you, this is what you see often in published papers talking about different aspects of reliability and validity, which ultimately makes the scale usable and see the light of the day. So I think this is the translation and adaptation process about which I thought I'll just orient the PGs and then we can have a discussion. I think this brings me to the end of my brief presentation, and I thank you all for your patient listening.
Thank you very much, sir. We have reached almost the end of the session. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for being part of this program today, taking the time to give your insights and expose us to a newer part of psychiatry, which some of the postgraduates can take up as their thesis work or research work. I would like to thank the presenter PG, Dr. Jeyanthy, for making the effort to do a comprehensive presentation going to the article, and the team from Karpaga Vinayaga who had helped her out. I would also like to thank the East West Pharma who had given this platform, making sure the AV connections are good. I would also like to thank our Chief S.Sivaraman sir for keeping us engaged and making it making this project successful by motivating us also. Thank you all. Thank you all the postgraduates who had put forward their questions and made this discussion very lively. Thank you one and all, sir.
Thank you.